All right, at 3:31 p.m., calling to order this August 20th board meeting for the Policy Committee. On our agenda today, we'll be talking about Policy KCD, Public Gifts and Donations, and Policy JLJ, Threat Assessment. Is KCG here, whoever's presenting? I hope so, but we do know that JLJ is here, so if the committee's up to it, we could switch.
No, that's me.
Oh, it's you.
That
That was a really bad joke.
Flew over.
So some things are said funny, some things are funny when they're said, and I think that was just meow.
Okay. So KCD was adopted in 2010, so about 9 years ago. It's an interesting policy because we love gifts and donations. It's a great thing for the district. We love our partners that give us very generous donations. But we wanted to add a little more substance as far as the ability for the district to regulate what kind of gifts and donations we get without limiting the generous gifts and donations that we get from others.
Good, excellent. So we can also take a moment and thank the tech crew who is always with the board but never gets seen, so public thanks to the tech crew.
Yeah, it's good to be out here. Okay, so a gift that we could get would be a functioning clicker. No, I'm just kidding. Okay, so one of the policies that we just added within the last couple of years was the wellness policy. So in the policy, you'll see an update to where we can not accept gifts or donations from alcohol, tobacco, or other companies that produce products that are known to harm children. So that's something that was not in our policy before. There are some grant reporting standards that were added to the policy that were not there before to be in line with DDA. And KGF, there's a line in there that says that just because we receive something does not imply endorsement of a company that provides those gifts to us.
So Joe, while we're on this slide, just for a timely interruption, apologize, but within the wellness policy, there are specific FDA requirements for sodium, fats, things like that. Would gifts of, say, things like cupcakes for a birthday then be prohibited by this policy?
That's a great question, and we're definitely open to feedback on that.
Okay.
So then, as I mentioned earlier, which will be just seconds ago when we cut this into a beautifully neat, tech-free, problem-free video, this bulks up the additional guidance on the acceptance of standards. So one of the pieces that we have is time limits and capacity. So for example, if we are gifted 5,000 tickets for an event that occurs tomorrow, we would not be able to accept that gift because we won't be able to distribute those gifts equitably or widely enough. So this gives us kind of the way to, if a gift isn't provided with us to be able to use it, there's really no sense in us accepting that. Another thing that was added to the policy along those lines is excessive costs of maintenance and installation. So for example, if a company gives us
A koi pond.
yeah, and it's just, it'll cost.
Having been at Green Street Academy when their koi pond broke left.
Yeah, so it'll cost more for us to upkeep it than it would be to get it in the first place. So some things that are going to be added in between policy committee and second reader are added definitions of technical requirements, safety requirements, and programmatic requirements. So that might be something where we could look into whether cupcakes would fall under those wellness restrictions. And also, we're in the process of researching a national list of standards to see what other nonprofits and other school agencies do. If they have an overall list of, we won't accept a computer, because we also want the best for our kids, right? So if someone's giving us a computer that is, has a floppy disk drive, we might not necessarily want to use that. So just getting those national standards up to par to give our kids the best possible gifts. So what we're looking for is some additional guidance on the money piece of it. So right now, if something is over $250, it needs to be recognized by the board, which is fine. But then when we get into the part of it being over $2,500, per policy, it requires board approval, which is a practice that I wouldn't say is being done with fidelity at the moment. So for example, if a school is given a $3,000 HD TV for their computer lab, technically speaking, they couldn't accept and use that gift until the board approved of it. So what we're looking to do is to increase those amounts. And the numbers that I met with legal and they felt comfortable with me talking about, but really, as I said, we're really looking for guidance from you all on this, is to lower that, and these numbers are outlined in the back page of RA, the regulation. So we're looking at the $1 to $500, $500 to $5,000, and then anything $5,000 and above would actually require that approval, because that would be a pretty substantial gift. And then the other piece that I'm working with Dr. Durant on that I wanted to also put out for feedback from you all to ask a pointed question to the community is just how explicit we should be in linking this to the equity policy and making sure that if a company gives us a gift, how are we going to make sure that it's equitably distributed throughout the district, and kind of suggestions for language that we could use in the policy for that. Because sometimes gifts are given specifically to schools, and obviously then we're not going to say, no, you can't give it to that school that you intended to give it to, but if a company gives 500 basketballs to the district, how are we going to distribute those? Next slide. So these are the groups that I've sent the policy and regulations to a few weeks ago. I know it's during the summertime. We kind of have the luxury with this policy that the first reader is not for about another month and a half or so, and then second reader is a month after that. So I'm definitely, after I get feedback from you all, whether it's in writing or today, I'm gonna, reach back out to these groups. I've heard back from most of them that they're reviewing it and that they're in the process of giving feedback, but any additional feedback would be very warmly welcomed. So that's all that I have.
Questions or comments? So Mary, what are your thoughts on the thresholds? The $1 to $500, the $500 to $5,000, $5,000 above? I think that's a specific question we're looking to weigh in on. It's just on.
It's on? Okay. I don't think that fast.
Okay.
Let me think of it.
Okay, Ronald, do you have a thought on that specific question?
What's the thinking of where you all are thinking, like the 1 to 500 or why are you thinking the way that you're thinking currently 4 hour feedback?
Yeah, that's a great question. So really it comes to the issue of if something is a lot of, okay, so the 500 to 5,000 one that's something that needs to be reported to the board, right, and accepted. Whereas, for example, if a principal is, given a laptop or something to use at their school, they might not think of it as a gift that needs to be reported, right? So this is to try and keep people in compliance. So in that $500 to $5,000 range, we're not going to see really gifts given to people that extend over that, and if they do, it should require board approval. But just that $2,500 threshold, the $250 to $2,500 is a pretty small number, because then, as it stands now, $300. I mean, if you get a jacket or something, that might be $300.
It's
right?
half
And
of a
then
bus for a field trip.
Yeah, and then you would technically have to report that to the board, or else you would be out of compliance.
Yeah, I think that's part of the concern now.
I think so, yeah.
I think that's part of the concern now is that at each different school, if somebody donates 3 backpacks, they would then have to be reporting it. They're supposed to be reporting it to you. And I just think we're opening up opportunities for principals that are probably not likely to think about 3 backpacks as something they have to report to the board, but that probably would currently trigger the limit. And so we don't want to set up situations where schools are kind of unintentionally violating a policy that may not really have a reasonable threshold.
And that's why I asked my colleagues first, because I believe in raising it and have no problem with it being raised. I do like the idea of anything 500 to 5,000 being reported to the board so that we can communicate to the community that we like gifts and we appreciate and we acknowledge, so that, 500 isn't a lot, but 500s becomes more.
Are we bound by COMAR with the amount that we have to approve, or is it just something that we wrote in policy? So the 5,000.
Yeah, so I talked with legal and I talked to our auditing department, and they couldn't find anything that made us beholden to these specific dollar
So it's really just our policy that we created,
That's correct.
or that the board.
So do you feel like you have enough guidance to move forward?
Yeah,
Yeah.
if you all feel comfortable with those numbers that I proposed, then I think that we can.
Yeah, because I obviously don't want it to become a record-keeping nightmare either. You know, we want principals to be entrepreneurial and engaging with the community. And I know if I have to make a report on a $1,000 donation, I don't have time to make the report, so I'm not going to go solicit the
Yeah, or like an individual teacher gives them an air conditioner for their classroom,
Right.
like that, they're just probably not thinking about that as something they had to report. And
Exactly.
So I don't want the teacher to be in violation because of that.
That makes perfect sense.
But also, what is our system for reporting?
Yeah, so that,
Right, so is it a form, is it an extensive process? If a principal gets a gift of over $5,000, how are they keeping that? How tedious is the process for a person to report the gift?
So I do not believe it's tedious. I think it's literally, there's like an online database that's part of our website that you log into. I think that we definitely need to have better regulations as far as because right now, I can't really think of a time where a gift or donation had to go to board for approval, right? So I know that we've gotten gifts over $2,500. You know, I think that we recognize them at board meetings, but I can't think of a time where it had to go to vote for approval. So that's something that we definitely need to look into as far as that being a separate process than just logging it in the database.
is it possible that that could be just a link on the dashboard so that, because one of my challenges with policies in general is I'm out in the field and I see policy violations all the time because people simply don't know.
Yeah.
So one of the things that I'd love this committee to take on is figuring out how we publicize and inform of policies a little bit better, and perhaps a link on the dashboard to just say, did you get a donation? Click here. So teachers and principals.
I agree. I think the approval is one thing, but I think that the reporting, I think this is my opinion, I think that every gift should be, I think we need to know what the gifts are. I think going back to the thought around the equity policy, what does the distribution of gifts and donations look like across the system? And so if there is a way, right, to just know what the gifts are, whether or not we have to approve them, I think that there should just be a database or way to collect the records, because that was going to be one of my questions. Is there a system for record keeping? So whether the gift is reported, whether we have to approve it, or whether they're just accepting the gift and documenting it, I think that the process for that should be simple, but standardized across the system so that we're all aware of the gifts and donations that are coming in. Secondly, is there a way to categorize the gifts to perhaps help, with the idea of equity? So if they're large, Under Armour gives a huge donation for equipment,
Uniforms for every high school.
uniforms or whatever.
That we haven't, we didn't approve, and I'm sure was one of that's.
How do we categorize those, right, to kind of help with the distribution of where those resources go? So is it equipment? Is it curriculum enhancement or support resources? Like, how do we categorize them? I think that's a question that I think we should consider.
So in the current database that we use, there is a drop-down that does categorize whether it's curricular or equipment or cash donation or things like that. So that's in the system we currently have.
In the presentation, when this comes up for first reader, is there a way, people screenshot the processes? Is there a way to do that for us so that we could see that process in the presentation?
Absolutely.
I think it would help,
Okay.
not just us, but everyone to understand what the process actually is for reporting gifts. And then, I'm sorry.
I have a
Dr.
process,
Barkley.
but Dr. Berkeley, do you have any process questions?
No, I think this discussion is important, because I think what we're saying, we don't know.
Yeah,
And if we don't know, who else doesn't know? And so are we following it?
yeah. So do you have more process?
Fundraising, yes,
Okay.
processing.
Because I have good process.
If schools are doing fundraising campaigns, how are we documenting because they're generally like individual gifts that probably are not over $5,000 or whatever, but as a whole, once the fundraiser is over, I'm sure that the amounts are large, at least we hope. How are we tracking that type of,
Philanthropic, like readathons or.
sure, how are we tracking
It's a
that?
It's a good question. In the regulation, any cash gift has to be logged and reported under the student activities fund. So this policy is more for like tangible gifts and donations. I believe we have a student activity fund policy coming up later in the year that'll be more geared towards that.
And that is an area where there are often challenges with implementation as well. So one of the things that we're looking at as a follow-up to a recent audit committee meeting is how do we make that guidance more, have appropriate controls, but also be something that people can implement. Because if it just has a bunch of rules that are just, nobody's thinking of implementing, they don't particularly provide a control, and nobody's complying with it because they're not thinking that it's there, that's not helpful. So how do we streamline it to the things that are most important to provide the kind of controls that protect the board and the CEO, but also can be implemented in a reasonable way in a school setting?
Appreciate that, and to also create a process that is simple enough that encourages schools and school leaders to solicit the donations from community members and fundraising activities.
So that leads to three of my questions. So I also had the question about activity funds, and I talked to a few different banks who they have the ability to set up a parent account, so the central office could see all the school accounts, but the school accounts can function autonomously. Rather than right now, I know every school just banks where they feel like banking, and audit is an oversight challenge for us. So I'm wondering if there doesn't at least need to be a crosswalk statement at the bottom of this policy of see also policy once we get the activity fund policy done. And then as far as soliciting, in the regs it was hard to see if there's any rules for soliciting to make sure that we don't fatigue any particular giver or friend, as well as to make sure in that drop down which strategic goal does this align with, because if it doesn't align with the strategic goal, not all money's good money, or all services are good services. So those were two things that I want to make sure they're someplace. And they didn't pop out to me, but.
In KCD-RA 3G, there's a line that it basically gets to the point of we don't want principals it's going to actually say city school staff. We don't want people to use a third-party solicitor. So that's going to be more explicit in the regulation. The language is a little confusing at the moment. But that's definitely something that we're looking into. For that same reason, we don't want 20 principals to go to the same people asking for money, right? So we need it to be more of
So I think there needs to be a regulation on solicitation.
Okay.
So a gift is one thing. They came to you and said, here, we want to give this to you. But if you're going to go out and recruit for, hey, we really need, the Department of Natural Resources to sponsor a field trip to some forest. So we go and ask them. Well, if it's more than a certain dollar threshold that you're going to solicit, you need to let us know in advance. And we don't have a development office, so that's kind of hard. I don't know where that would sit. But in order to avoid that fatigue, because it's a challenge. So something in there around that. And then the other, that's actually on. So that was my three. So.
Dr. James Hassan, when in the slide, Joe, it says outreach, what does that actually mean? Because we see it often in the presentations, and I know that some areas, some departments are a bit more deliberate about what that actually means. And I'm just curious to know, what does outreach mean in this particular regard? Particularly with the student organizations, I'm curious.
Yeah, so I remember you said that, so I tried to gear my slide towards you specifically, but I apparently failed. So I sent the policy regulation and the timeline of the policy first reader and second reader to all of those groups. I heard back from the majority of them saying that they were looking into it and that they were I'm scheduled to speak at PCAB So I really haven't gotten feedback yet, but all of those groups have been contacted. When I come back for first reader, I'll have more pointed, hopefully, feedback from those groups. But at the moment, as I said, I know it's summertime, so, I heard from Mr. Sean Bailey, who is the advisor of ASCPC, and, I think it's hard at this point really to get student feedback on this, and, as a teacher, people are trying to get squeeze the final juice out of their summer vacation, so, I think once we get into September, I'll start re-engaging with people to try and get more of a sense of feedback.
And perhaps, it's just an idea,
Mhm.
but perhaps inviting these groups together maybe here, to just for a few minutes, an hour or so, to kind of get some collective feedback. And then I think that will be helpful too, because each of those groups will be able to hear the interests of each other to kind of support the generalized feedback that comes to us for first reader,
The focus group.
like a focus group.
Yeah. So one of the things that I thought, because this has come up before, and I remember it being sort of like a ooh to me a couple of years ago, because when I would read this prior to that, we had made the assumption that these groups had already been intimately involved in the process, rather than just we're going to talk to them. So, and this one might be for Chief Perkins-Cohen, is there a way we can color code this so we've talked to and met with the ones in green, we've reached out and heard back from the ones in yellow, we reached out to the ones in red but haven't heard back. So then we can help lean in and say things like, well, PCAB, you haven't heard back on this, we really need you to weigh in. Rather than having them all look as though we've already had deep, meaningful conversations. And there could be a different color for we invited you to a focus group, or you send us a written reply. I don't think we need to get super in-depth, but just as an idea of, in this presentation, who has informed it. Anything else on this one? No? All right, thank you, Joe, appreciate you. And then we are up to policy JLJ threat assessment. Excellent clicking, Christian, excellent. Welcome. Please introduce yourselves for the record.
James Torrance, Staff Specialist for Strategy and Compliance.
Deborah Brooks, Executive Director of Special Education.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. We are presenting policy JLJ, which is the student behavioral threat assessment policy. This policy is a preventative policy and intervention-based policy for students and staff or anyone in that building who exhibit threatening behaviors or exhibit or show some threatening behaviors. It's proposed to formalize our caring practices and identify assessing and excluding individuals with behaviors that pose a threat. Namely, we have a crisis management system in place that we're currently using. This follows that structure. It is basically outlining what we currently do in our practices as an industry. Also, we place a requirement that all foreign employees, volunteers, and contractors are required to report threats immediately to the school administrator.
So, James, can you give us a little idea of the threat assessment team? How nimble are they?
So,
Do they have student responsibilities or?
I'll explain it. So, when we begin to discuss our threat assessment team and how that looks, we thought about what makes sense at the school level and what does the school look, see, and hear every day. One of the things that we know is the most stable force in the building currently will be our social workers for next school year, where we have one full-time social worker at every school. And we understand that to make an assessment of someone and whether they're an imminent threat or they may exhibit some type of threatening behavior that may be low level, we would need to make appropriate referrals, and we think that the social worker would be a key point of contact for that. That's what that school administrators. We say school administrators because when we're getting together, we're thinking about what is their role. Their role is to advise and help provide information for us, as well as the school manager who helps with things like report it back to the district office. So we thought about it in tiered support. There are things that a principal in a school, a principal in or another administrative building with a social worker can problem solve that's low risk. But the principal can call in the manager and the social worker when they exhibit something that's either medium or high risk, as well as school bullies, that they potentially to crime. What we want to think about is that we want to look at the common things that our school leaders and our communities will see and the actionability that they can have.
So this is not a centralized team that comes from Fifth Avenue?
So we also have a centralized team, but also before we go to the centralized team, for the school-based team, if the person that is either posing the threat or the target of the threat is a student with a disability, it also must be someone that's familiar with that student. It could be a teacher, a special education teacher, or a related service provider that is familiar with that student. So whether it's a school social worker that's already a member of the team that's familiar with the student, or a school psychologist that works very closely with that student and knows something about that student. So I wanted to also interject that is also a member of the team, depending upon if the student is a student who currently has an IEP or 504 plan.
Perfect. So my question then, in the regulations, it reads, because the chief executive officer has to designate the teams, is that a level of school-based management that just is outside of the capacity of the
So,
superintendent?
The state law, when they pass it, gave us the ability to have an oversight team that assists with determining the number of actual assessment teams. So when we looked at our current structure on our crisis prevention teams, it's CLN based, because you know your schools, they're regionally located near each other. So if you're out at a school and there's an incident manager and they're regionally located, you may be accessible to that area faster. So we're thinking about the minutia in terms of like what is actionable for our staff at that time. So social work is there daily, so they'll know the student or the related service provider as well. So we're thinking about how does that look, and then also for fidelity purposes, when we train the staff and we continue to train the staff on this matter, we want to make sure that it's people that have cohesive understanding of it. And with our social workers, we have them in our 160 odd buildings. We have, I believe, 12 managers, and then we have our school leaders. So it's basically making sure that we have a cohesive team, because we want to, and the thing that we discussed about the equity portion of it, is ensuring that we have a common shared cohesive understanding of what this assessment looks like and the roles that everyone is in. So while we're currently putting the guidance document together, we're defining the role of a principal, we're defining the role of a social worker, because we want to norm and set the standards for those persons to say, this is my role. As an administrator, I would personally think that it's my job to be there to be of assistance, because this is something that's starting in the community, but I may also be biased. So that group assessment, we understand that also with our social workers, they have a license. There's licenses on the line every time they do this assessment. So they also have by law a requirement to tell a target that they were a target of the threat. So we also give them the last straw as well, and then we have our district oversight team there to support those teams, because we want to make sure that we are being as precautious as possible, but also giving students and community resources that they need.
No, and that's wonderful. I was thinking more specifically so under policy standards, where the CEO or CEO designee shall establish the behavioral assessment team or teams to support the school district, sounds like it's a district level team versus a school level team. And then I don't know about my board colleagues, but when I hear CEO or CEO designee, I'm thinking it's a chief level or an ILED designee. I'm not thinking that the CEO may designate the school social worker or the art teacher
So
Or
as
the principal,
or
it could
the
be a principal.
right, yeah. But do we want to say that, or the principal designee at the school?
I mean, we can certainly consider that. I mean, I think, we could give it a such as list. I think it's not, the CEO could make anybody a designee, so it could be anybody.
Right.
It doesn't have to be chief.
Okay.
So there are, I think, other policies.
Because again, it goes to who's at the school and knows who's going to function and best in that role.
Mhm.
And it just seems like a lot of work for the CEO that could be handled at this,
Mhm. But if they make the designee principals, each school
just
principal.
principals. Yeah, that, a category, that makes sense, okay. So she doesn't have to go through and say, this principal and this social, okay. That's what I was, because that's the way it reads here, is
Mhm.
as if she's going to somehow or another make a list of,
Yeah.
at this school, it should be this
So-
person.
No, it could be through guidance that says all
Beautiful.
principals will be designees.
Okay.
Currently, our recommendation is CLN based because that is the most functional way that we can actually follow through the policy, and also it makes sense for where we have our staff, the training of our staff, and make sure we have that cohesion.
So maybe even saying that
Yeah.
in here.
So in the policy, we kept it broad, but I think that we can add that it will be CLN based in the actual regulation, because we can amend the regulation later, just in case that we do training strategies, and if we want to go to individual teams at every school.
Thank you.
So we also get into the definition of threat. As you can see in subsequent slides, we actually categorize threats so that the public understands what a threat is and the types of threats and how the substance of the threat can change the response of the actual team. So a threat is really an intent to cause harm to someone, as well as express or communicate behavior orally, visually, or with written and electronic communication. We also discuss behavioral threat assessment and how to take group process, but we also understand that because of current restrictions that a licensed clinician will have to sign off on anything that is a part of that assessment. We also understand that we have to create a process that's cohesive, and that's why we have the threat assessment definition. And then non-affiliated persons, because we know that this can extend past students to their actual family members or someone broadly in the general public. Types of threats. So we talk about transient and substantive threats. Transient threats can be anywhere from a joke to temporary feelings. So a child that's having a tantrum could easily be a low-level threat, which is a transient threat, or a child that's moving a chair, or something that simply can be resolved with having a conversation or a counseling session with a child, or something that needs an apology or retraction. With substantive threats, we think about intent to harm. We're talking about maiming, killing, raping, or harming someone. We're talking about positive things. So we need to know something. You have the method and the means and the motive to commit something that can permanently harm someone or cause disruption to the school environment, as well as think about what is the infliction that you possibly have. And then we have to have evidence of it. We have to know that if you are posing that threat, if you have the need to do it, because that's the difference between high risk and moderate threat versus an imminent threat, because we know that you're currently an imminent threat, whereas you can carry it out in a minute.
So I know this is addressed in other policies, but for the sake of the public, if you know, and if you don't know, I'm not trying to stump you at all. But the role of online and virtual threats versus in-person or in writing.
Yeah, so we have the online, that's why we say electronic, because we know that not all threats will be communicated person to person. And we understand that, for instance, if someone were to call in a threat, that is a possible threat. It's an imminent threat until we understand the reality of the motives and needs for it.
I just wanted that out there. Thank you.
So in terms of the policy, we are going to community learning network structure to support district schools. We have 160 schools. We felt that this was a reasonable way of handling when discussing with the supervisor or managers and understanding the manager who was currently in the group. And it makes sense because administratively that person can help with the Ministerial Central Office. The social work is there day to day so they can help with referrals and case management. And the principal is there as a leader and oversight as access to information that we may not all have access to. So, and we emphasize when necessary law enforcement. And we talk typically about city schools who's training our de-escalation as well. But we understand that sometimes that actions may, that a threat may be physical violence that may have someone actively removed. And we understand that we want to be a preventative environment for this, for any purpose. In terms of it, we discussed that the law gives us a determination because some of our school districts are not greedy in terms of the number of schools and staffing. Having over 160 schools, we're taking into effect the geographic, the demographics, also the number of schools, and availability of resources. In terms of our district oversight team, Dr. Brooks is here. We wanted to put the executive directors and the director and chief of police as the main persons, but bringing affiliate persons in needed especially when we talk about harmful care, as well as other things that we can do to prevent threats in schools, and review our current and continue to review the process to make sure that we're doing things streamlined. One of the things is that United social workers that fall under our special education related services. Our whole child office has our restorative practices as well as our wholeness rooms. So we're talking about how we cohesively talk across offices. So this makes an opportunity for us to broaden this current practices and put it into play. Also, our director of student conduct attendance, one of the things that we know is that this is more than just nuts, bolts, and threat. We also need to understand the whole child in a different way. So we need to look at your attendance. We need to understand, have you had any disciplinary action before? And another thing is that if there's a student that has a disability, we need special educators there to understand it as a manifestation of their disability. And how do we prevent that without removing them from their educational environment and supporting them with the appropriate interventions.
And so Dr. Brooks, within your department, do you have the ability to do really fast response manifest determinations?
We do. And so we've been working very closely with the Director of Student Conduct and Attendance to make sure that we are not violating students' rights, to ensure that if a student does have a disciplinary action, that we are holding those manifestation meetings and are making data-informed decisions. Also ensuring that if there is a student that is displaying types of behaviors, that we are looking through the lens of what appropriate supports and resources are in place for both the students and the families of those students that have IEPs, but also students that have 504s.
Thank you.
Also, we discussed how this oversight team will happen. So one of the things when we talk about the process of effective information sharing, so one of the things that we've learned is that we don't know when trauma happens in a household sometimes, and that trauma can actually lead to the school district, to a classroom. For instance, a foster child who may have lost their mother the night before. We don't know if that low risk or that high risk has been related to that, and that's why we talk about information sharing, because we don't have access to a lot of external things. And often we do get a list, but we need to be able to have that conversation with other agencies, as well as for Dr. Fink, we have expanded school mental health. How do we make those appropriate referrals? If a student has substance use issues, how do we make that appropriate referral as well? Because that's that information share we're discussing. We're not discussing providing the directory information for our students. We're providing things that bring resources and supports to that student. And we only share what is in within the guidelines of the federal government and state law. In terms of outlining the regulation highlights, we highlight the reporting requirements, the procedure, and we establish the procedure. We purposely put a high level of the procedures because a lot of our surrounding LEAs are not providing that high level. We're being purposeful in providing that high level. We also know that a lot of LEAs are currently creating their guidance documents, and we're looking at those guidance documents because we know that we need to streamline our forms and streamline how we do these things. So we're seeing LEAs put in there the referrals and systems and their case management system to a singular form that allows us to share the things that they can share IEP meetings, they can share SST meeting, and these are just a common form that we all can use to do, and again, is actually sync with what we have in our current data systems too. So we just want to make sure that we're being purposeful in how we're making our current practices more efficient.
So a question related to that is around sort of our philosophical belief around this. Are we as a district wanting to lean into the child stays at the school because the child has community, even if they've violated that community as we go to more restorative practices? Or are we pushing the rock to another school? And how are we helping principals support that?
So the goal is to not remove a student from their educational environment. The goal is to provide them with the interventions and prevention from having any behavior activity again. But there are some extreme cases where we might have to use disciplinary action. And we put that in there because we understand that that is a last resort. We, in anything that we have in our policies when we're moving students from the building, there's a process for ensuring that the preventions and interventions were in place before we remove. It has to be the last resort to remove students from that environment.
And then a process for reentry in their new environment?
Yes.
Thank you.
As well as providing supports and services for the school staff to be able to say, these are the appropriate supports that are needed, these are additional supports that the school may need to be able to provide those supports and services for that student and that family.
So in the next slide, we put it into context. So we recognize that we need to make appropriate referrals and employ positive behavior interventions and approaches for low-risk threats. So if my child in pre-K classes is taking from books, we need to figure out how to review use that actual threat. Because we can't remove that child, we have to provide them the actual supports to help them manage their developmental and emotional supports and coping mechanisms to be in the environment. Also, we gotta understand that medium and high risk threats will more likely result in possible disciplinary action if it is extreme, especially if there is an assault with a weapon in such instances. So we have to think about how do we provide an intervention plan to prevent it again, especially if it's bullying. How do we do those things? Do we have documentation of these incidents as well? And we gotta think about the case management. That's why we go back to the social worker model that we have for employee next year. That's a person that's full-time in your building Monday through Friday if they're not there. If they're not, if they're not home. But also, it's the stabilizing case management perspective. And also within the threat, we understand that within the threat, we more than likely will have to bring in law enforcement, especially if such things as law threat. We also talked about the requirement of reporting. We really want people to understand the reporting, so we're thinking purposely about how we educate our staff on reporting requirements and recognizing things that they need in place, especially our principals. If a principal, so if it's a low risk threat, we expect that a principal and a social worker can do the appropriate referrals and interventions there, especially if they have a homeless room or if there's some type of positive intervention. But if there's something where there's a potential that a student may be group assaulted later after school, then a principal needs to call the appropriate people to help with supporting them. Or if a student is having psychosis, or if a student is having an emotional crisis, that we need to deal with appropriate with our mental practitioners. Also, engaging and understanding the likelihood that this policy has to have a philosophy of referrals first and prevention first. Because we have to recognize that the onus is that we are there to deal with the students that are in there, and we receive residents as they come.
And also, I would say for principal reporting, that there's nothing punitive, so that we get accurate data, at least as a baseline.
And there's nothing, and it's not punitive for the student.
Right. Either the one that reports, the one that observes, the one that perpetrates or allegedly perpetrates.
So to give you an idea, we've had a conversation with Maryland Disability Rights Maryland, and the other coalition for the coalition in terms of like student behavioral issues. They've been active partners when we've done regulations like this to help us with the correct guidance document, the purposeful way of doing it, and that's why we're trying to set these in September to say, hey, this is where we are in our drafts, we need your help. Because we understand that they see things that we don't see, and they can be more honest with us about how we can improve. And we see it as an active partnership, especially when we think about the process. Assessing threats.
Can I just commend you on that? That I'm really impressed that you're reaching out now and it's working so you're partners and not, well done.
With assessing threats, we walk through in the actual procedure of whether or not you can identify the threat, what the appropriate things are. So, for instance, the school administrator, if you notice that this is a threat that cannot be handled at the school, you should notify your manager and you assess the team to assess it and triage it. But we also put in there requirements that we must notify if a threat has a specific target, to notify the target, because we have to show their safety and ensure the safety of the community as well. We also understand that there might be some unsureness about whether the level of threat, so that's another reason to bring the assessment team. But if there's a shortness of the level of threat, then we can help with that determination as well.
I think about the opening scene to Men in Black with Will Smith going through the room and ends up taking a little girl who's not there because she shouldn't be there, but everybody else was like, yeah, they're just working out.
So the idea is this aligns with current practices. For instance, we talk about triage, and we talk about reviewing the actual behavior or the communication. But we also talk about school records and prior history, because if a student has a disability and is manifesting this behavior, and there's a reported history that's documented about it, we need to figure out what are the supports say as well. But we also need to understand that we need to interview people to have a realistic full 360 understanding of what happened with that threat. If it was overheard by someone, or if we saw a manic behavior that we need to really think about. Because this is informing the process to help the students. So we talk about not identify a low-level threats. We talk about the process of doing that and how the degree into reasonable confidence that we have. We say reasonable confidence because we're not always sure. We're not always going to be sure. We're not always going to be exactly what that threat is, but we want to make sure for best practices. If we are not sure, we should do the best to determine that. For interviewing, monitoring, and resolving threats, we're talking about case management. One of the things we're saying we got from the state and from a different jurisdiction is creating common forms to make sure that case management is easy, accessible, and knowing where to place that management policies. We don't want students or anyone stigmatized by any assessment.
And speaking to case management, since you brought it up, it's not technically off topic, it's relative. In city schools, are generally, Dr. Brooks, are special educators tasked with case management?
So for students that are currently receiving special education and related services, if they have academic goals, then the special educator is the case manager. If the student only has, let's say, speech language because of, they just have the speech language goals, the speech pathologist may be the case manager. What we're speaking here is case management. This could be a general ed student that is displaying threatening behavior, and so the social worker will be case managing because they needed additional behavioral interventions. What we also want to ensure is that students that may display these behaviors are not automatically identified as a student that needs to receive special education and related services, but that we put the appropriate supports and services in place to be able to help the student at this time, and also help the targeted student. Because again, it goes back to looking back over trend data to see, has the student been a target before? If so, what was the case? And so just being very mindful about the case management, but more so that the case management is consistent across the district. But yes, in the cases for students that are, that have an IEP, but also for students that have 504s, then the 504 manager or chair is also the case manager for those students as well.
Something I'm going to talk to you about separately in regards to case management.
So we talk about classifying the threats as low risk, moderate, high. So we talk about that determination, and then we explicitly call that the clinician has the final straw on that because of their license requirements, but also because their license is on the line, they're going to be more cautious in our team. They're going to be ready to find out if there's resources that we can take us and do as much as possible. We also mentioned our disciplinary actions and how we understand when disciplinary action has to be taken because we're required by OMA in specific instances to do a certain amount of time. But in reality is that if a student is removed for disciplinary action, then at the time that they're out, we need to have that ability to do case management and actually talk about the prevention and interventions that we put in place to prevent the behavior from happening or occurring again. We talk about documentation. So we're going back to this documentation being thorough. So that's why the common forms across our offices that we use, if we can get to that form where it's singular and that everything's there, so we can see that there was SSD referral, we can see that there's been referrals for IEP, we can see that there's been a referral to the wholeness room. We can see these things in one common form. It allows us to best understand and allows us to talk, unknowingly talk to each other without having to. Also transfers, we're talking about a significant safety or security issue before we transfer a student, and we have to have those institutions in place. And we have to see you exhausted everything available resources. And we're talking about acting, so what resources do you have? If you don't have resource practice, what resources did you have to implement at that time to help the student in everything you've done?
And in thinking of transfers, does the potential school that will be receiving the student have the capacity to provide the support and services that that young person needs. Thank you. How has Chief Hand been tied in to the development of the policy draft?
So Chief Hand is on our work group for the actual implementation of the policy, so the guidance document, the role of school police officers in this, and the fact that school police officers have an interesting role in our buildings, the community aspect to it, as well as their interactions with students. Because often, sometimes our school police officers know more about the students outside of the school than we do, and they have a relationship. So we want to leverage those relationships, but everyone that's involved in the school community, we want to have some type of defined role for them.
And their training in intel, their intelligence insight they could probably provide to the development of this, but the actual implementation of what happens. And then secondly, it's somewhat relative to this because we talked about social workers, but with that mandate now for them, the theory is nice to have, but in practice, I'm sure that it can be difficult in staffing those actual roles for every school. It's like we have to have social workers in every school. What is the actual pool and the pool like in making sure that we have those folks in our schools? Because it's great to have to say that, but then are there qualified folks actually being put in those positions?
So there are qualified social workers in the positions, and after this meeting, I'm actually meeting with my staff because we were just about fully staffed.
Seriously,
Nice.
So I will
go down.
be able,
Yeah.
so I will be able to know those exact numbers right after this meeting. But this was something that we heard loud and clear from our principals, and knowing the need that it's a school need, but it's also a community
Absolutely.
need, because they also provide those resources from outside agencies to be able to provide those additional resources to our schools and to our families and to our students.
So
I
this,
think just relating to that, I think one thing we really thought about this year with those additional positions, and then for the concentration of poverty schools, we have the community schools position, community schools coordinators. So how are these various positions that we've got related service providers? And then with the leftover resources for the concentrations of poverty schools, some people have higher positions,
Mhm.
maybe guidance counselor. So how are those various positions working together? So one thing we're really starting to think about is how do we clarify roles and responsibilities and think about, or a wholeness specialist in a wholeness site. How do those positions, what are their individual roles and responsibilities, and how do they work together to really build relationships with students, make sure there's a network of support for students and that resources are leveraging each other.
and then, way in the weeds, but if the social workers are being paid through special ed and billable hours, what is their capacity to work with and interface with students who are typically developing? There's a lot of kids, there's a lot of need, and that's all that's all. Do you have anything else? Commissioner Berkman? So one just general sort of philosophical statement, this happens with policies all the time that come through, is this is a what if something happens policy. So I'm hoping that in the preamble in the next draft, we are implementing relationship building and community building and creating positive steps before to prevent, and something that, just so that we continue to say to teachers and students and parents that yes, we have policies in place if something should happen, but what we really want to do is try and prevent something from happening in the first place. And this feels much like the code of conduct and others that have come through, that it's punitive looking first rather than preventative first. So, and I think the preamble's in place for it, but I don't.
I think that would be perfect because one of the things is that educators have said that what are the supports for the victim of a threat? And this is a conversation that's come up in our policies about what are the supports, and we're purposeful about thinking, how do we provide supports that if you are the target of a threat, what do we offer you, what referrals are we making for you? Because this is not totally about the person who's threatening, but also about how do we deal with you.
And in that, there's teacher and principal professional development for things like teachers say, but one more time, because that's a threat. And so helping teachers understand that they have a role in modeling and stuff. So, anything else? Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Mr. Gann, do we have a list of order, or we just? No one signed up in advance, okay. So this is the time we would come to public comment, and since no one signed up in advance, but I'm thinking there's some folks here that would like to address us. So if you could, I don't know, Demonte, are you chatting with us today, or Corey, you chatting with us? If someone would like to, I'll open up the floor for you for 3 minutes of public comment. If you're just here to be supportive, thank you, and we love having more guests at policy. Sure. So what our practice is at this point is we'll have a hard stop at 5, but if there's 3 minutes, we'll go through anybody in the galley that would like to. Corey, if you decide you want to take more than 3 minutes, we'll put you at the end of the queue. Okay? Yep. And then just introduce yourself because the record is video and audio.
You want us to both come on?
I want you to do what best suits you, darling.
My name is Corey Weaver, and I'm a teacher on release from the classroom working at the Baltimore Teacher Union doing member engagement this year. And something that I was curious about is like when this gets to implementation, right, you inevitably come up with the good intention and the good policy, and then how does it play out in an often under-resourced system? And so I'm wondering, what does this look like when you come up with those sort of tensions of, okay, I might have identified a medium or high level threat, and now we want this team of people from a variety of perspectives to come together, make a really thoughtful suggestion of how to best address that threat and support the folks who are involved in it. And at the same time, there's like okay, but then we literally need to get these people together, right? And they're from different places. That may take a while. They have other obligations. So I'm just wondering, what does this look like in terms of just a literal timeline? How long does it take for them to get together? Do we want to put in guidelines mandating that they get together within a certain period of time to make some recommendations, especially in those higher level threat situations? And I'm not coming here with an already formed suggestion that we're planning on speaking. It's just a question that came to mind. Like, where are these places where we want this to go a certain way, and in places where we just literally don't have enough people and folks have scheduling and overwhelmed? Like, where are those places that are going to come up, those challenges that we can think about beforehand and what we're going to do about those?
And I think that's what I was referencing earlier with how do we do implementation and communication. So I'm really glad the union's here to chat with us because I think there's some things we could do together.
Yeah, and I guess I would also say then in response to that, that we should do some thinking about like what does a continuous sort of cycle of feedback and communication look like as this gets rolled out so that we can keep making it better and seeing where those issues come up as they come up. And we'd be delighted to be a part of that work.
So I'm Diamond Tay Brown, I'm the president of the Baltimore Teachers Union, and I had a couple of thoughts as it relates to the threat assessment policy, and the goal to have our schools resourced with social workers. So I'll start with the threat policy. I wanted to know who is the administrator supposed to report to and what is their timeline for the reporting. And I had a thought that maybe there should be students and parents that are also a part of the threat assessment team. And lastly, as it regards to social workers in every school, I think that's a really good goal, and I want to know what is the district's plan to communicate the successes and update employees on where they are in reaching that goal. If they reach the goal, like how will that be celebrated and communicated?
Excellent. Yeah, I think the timeline is a really important piece to consider, informing afterwards, even if it's just a forensic. Excellent. All right, thank you. Is there anyone else that would like to join us that's here? Once, twice, 3 times? Okay. All right, with that, our next policy meeting is September 17th from 3:30 to 5:30 in this room. We will talk about JKA, which is Behavioral Interventions and Student Discipline. So I would love to put out a personal request that if there are students that are interested in student discipline, we'd really like to hear from you, student groups, as well as parents or people who support students and student success. So if it's a chance for you as a social studies teacher to bring your students to be civically engaged, September 17th is a great time to do that. Anything else for the good of the whole, Commissioner McFadden or Dr. Berkeley? All right. With that, at 4:33 p.m., we are adjourned. Thank you.